Well, my clock says it's time to get started with our webinar. Welcome, Central Plains Mennonite Conference. Hopefully we'll have a few more churches joining us as we go along here. Just a little bit of a check. If you can hear me, wave your hand at me. Okay. My name is Chris Eisenbeis. I'm the chair of the Outreach and Service Committee that's sponsoring this event. At this particular time, we felt this issue was particularly relevant for all of us. And so I'm really looking forward to what our presenter, Drick Boyd, has prepared for us. But before we begin, I'd like us to start with a word of prayer. Dear God, we just thank you for bringing us together this evening as your gathered people. Even though it's in a way that's slightly different than usual, we thank you that you give us opportunities to witness to those around us, and we anticipate gaining understandings that will help us be more effective witnesses. Please bless our presenter as he shares what you've placed on his heart, and please bless and direct our discussions. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. So regarding our format this evening, we'll have about a 30 or 40 minute presentation to begin with, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So we'd like to have all our, everyone be muted except for our presenter during this first portion. And so if you haven't muted yourself, I'll probably mute you from here during this time. And then of course, later on, we'd like your participation with questions and discussions. So I will tell you a little bit about our presenter. So Drick Boyd is Professor Emeritus of Eastern University, where he taught courses in urban theology, leadership, social justice, and race and ethnic relations in the Department of Social Transformation. He's been active in social justice organizations, addressing issues such as gun violence prevention, fair funding of public schools, and gentrification. He's the author of 3 books. He's the father of 3 adult children. He lives in Broomall, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia, with his wife, Cynthia. And he's a member of West Philadelphia Mennonite Fellowship. So, Drick, we will turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I coming through okay? All right. Yeah, thank you so much. I want to thank the Outreach and Service Committee that helped organize this, and for Central Plains Mennonite for inviting me. While I'm in Philadelphia right now, I am actually a Midwesterner. I grew up in the Minneapolis, Minnesota area. And before moving to Philadelphia in 1992, I was in Winona, Minnesota. So I feel like I'm talking with people that are my people a little bit. And I also want to apologize for my voice. I've got a little bit of congestion in my voice, so I'll be drinking some water to keep myself lubricated. On the screen, if you put your mouse over the bottom, you see that there's a little bubble that says chat. If while I'm talking, a question or something you want to raise comes to you, you can type your question in there, and then when we open it up for discussion, I can go to those questions and address them. So you can do that even while I'm talking if something occurs to you. I assume that you are attending this webinar because you are concerned in some way or fashion about the prevalence of racism in our society and in our communities. And I share that concern. And I hope to share with you some of the things I've learned over the course of my life, especially my adult life over the past few decades, on this really important issue. And I call these, I'm calling what I'm going to be doing over the next 3 3 Tuesdays, I'll get it up here, musings of a recovering racist. I'll get the slideshow. There we go. And the reason I'm calling it musings is because I don't come to this with some idea that I'm an expert, but rather someone like I assume each one of you has been working in your own life and in your community and your churches on trying to understand how do we deal with this issue of racism in our society. And I hope to share some things that have helped me and that you might find some insight and help for yourself in whatever situation you find yourself. Now, the outline for our time together over the next 3 weeks is what you see on the screen. Tonight, we're really going to be defining our terms. What do we mean by racism? That word gets thrown a lot around in the media and in our society, but I'm not sure we always are talking about the same thing. So I wanted to take some time just to define our terms. Next Tuesday, we're going to talk about something that's been called white fragility. You may be familiar with a book by that title by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. And this book looks at why it's so hard for white folks to talk about racism. So I'll be drawing from some of the things that she's written in that book and some of my own experiences to talk about why is this such a difficult topic. And then the third session, I'll be drawing from a book that I've been writing over the past several months, which I've called Disrupting Whiteness. And it's really about how can we talk to each other as white folks about racism? So kind of building on why is it so hard, and okay, what can we learn and what can we do? Now, as was said, I have taught courses on race and ethnic relations for probably over 20 years. And one of the things that I always have said to my students is, this is probably one of the more difficult issues for us to talk about. And that is, guess what I need to say to all of you as we start out, that some of the things I might share will be uncomfortable. I may say some things that make you angry or upset, or maybe even feel guilty or just generally uncomfortable. And I'm not doing that to aggravate you, but just because this is such a difficult topic, and I don't want to sugarcoat it for you. This is tough stuff to deal with, but it's worth it, because as a nation and as white people, we can't go on as we have been, because things are changing. The demographics are changing. The racial makeup of our society is changing. And we all know about the polarity, both socially and culturally and politically, we're dealing with now. And all of this plays into and is part of what I'm going to talk about over the next 3 weeks. So I just want to kind of say that up front, that's part of what we're dealing with here. But before I jump into my presentation, I want to start with a confession. Confession is that I am a recovering racist. And let me say that again, that I am a recovering racist. And what I mean by that is that I'm a product of a family, of a community, and of a national culture that led me to believe that my experience as a middle-class, white, heterosexual male is basically the same experience of people regardless of race or gender or class or sexual orientation. And I was raised to believe that the success I had in life was solely the result of my intelligence and my hard work. I grew up believing that the education system, the criminal justice system, the government, other institutions in our society, while not perfect, sought to operate in a fair and impartial manner when it came to race. And so whatever I achieved and whatever I learned was the result of my playing by the rules and working hard. But what I didn't realize at the time was that the game was rigged in my favor. And I was socialized to believe that I was just a little smarter, a little more resilient, and therefore a little bit better than many others. And the fact that most of the people who achieved in the same areas that I did were white was not due to our race, we thought, but due to our superior effort. Racism was bred into me from the day I was born by loving parents, by diligent teachers, and other caring role models without my knowing and most likely without their knowing. I was like a child born into a drug-infested environment. I was bound to become addicted to the drug of white supremacy, and I am. Much of my personal journey toward an anti-racist lifestyle has involved unlearning my privileged and limited worldview and relearning a new way of seeing and living in the world. Now, I said I'm a recovering racist. Some of you may be familiar with the 12-step movements like Alcoholics Anonymous and Gamblers Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And then if you are, then you know that when people complete the 12-step program, they never say they are recovered. They always say they are recovering. And the genius of the 12-step movement is that it recognizes one is never free of addiction, but instead must continually work on one's recovery, because the minute one begins to limit or think that he or she is over it, they begin to slide back into their addiction. And in the same way, what I have learned and grown to understand is that a great deal, in regard to my own racism, I am sort of like an addict. And I have had to be reminded more times than I care to count that I still have work to do. So every time I teach a class or lead a discussion on race or do a webinar like this, I purposely turn the light on myself before I challenge others to look at themselves. So what I share with you tonight is only what I have already grappled with myself. And I confess that I still have a lot of growing and grappling to do. So race is one of those things that a lot of people don't like to talk about. And to be called a racist is one of the most hurtful and damaging things we can call another person, because we see it as an accusation, a criticism of our character, a challenge to our faith and moral decency. And there's no doubt that's how a lot of people use the word racism. But in this series, I want us to look at racism not as an accusation, but rather as a description and an integral part of our culture, our socialization, our family life, and our daily life. And just like a person who's an addict, who's struggling with an addiction, it's not that they're an evil person, it's that they're in need of liberation, they're in need of healing and a new way of living. The author, Richard Wright, moved to France after World War II because he just got tired of contending with racism at every turn. And like many Black authors and artists, he found France to be more accepting. And one day he was asked by a French reporter to comment on the Negro problem in the United States. And he responded by saying, "There isn't a Negro problem in the United States, there's only a white problem." See, that reporter, like many white people, saw racism as something people of color need to get over, they need to work through, they need to somehow learn to deal with. But White really diagnosed the problem correctly. It's those of us who are white who have the problem and have to deal with that problem. And so our purpose tonight is not to understand Black people or Mexican people or Chinese people or Hmong Americans or other people of other different races, but rather to really better understand ourselves, because that's where the source of the problem is. So I want to define some terms. So let's start with the word race. What do we mean by race? Is it have to do with the way we look, the way we talk, the food we eat, the sports we like? What makes someone white or Black or brown or Native American or Asian? Well, we know from scientific research that does nothing to do with our biology and has nothing to do with our DNA. across the races, people are more alike than they are different. And unfortunately, a lot of us have been told over the decades, over the centuries, that there is a significant fundamental difference between people who are of different races. But at the foundational biological genetic level, it just isn't true. Race is what sociologists call a social construct. A social construct is something that society has created to distinguish one group from another, and usually to place higher value on one group rather over the other. Let me use an example from a totally different realm. I'm a football fan. I'm a big fan of our NFL team, the Philadelphia Eagles. And to be an Eagles fan is to participate in a social construct called the Eagles fan. The team itself is changing players and coaches and owners all the time. But we who are Philadelphia fans, we don't really pay attention to that. It's that it's our team, and our emotions rise and fall with how our team does. Being an Eagles fan tells me who to root for and who to hate, who to praise and who to despise. And it has nothing to do really with the makeup of the people who are on the teams. It's really the social construct that I have created, that has been created, that I participate in, that says, this is who your people are, and those other people are not your people. You see, a social construct is a source of identity and ultimately culture that is developed over the years as people divide themselves in different ways according to these social constructs. And so when we talk about race, we're really talking about something that we as a society has created. You see, centuries ago, people in Europe who were in power decided that people who looked like me would be called white, and that other people would be called black, and others would be called Asian, and others would be called Indians, and so on. And they placed value on those, and they placed higher value on those they deemed white than over others. And so from that, white people developed a sense of self, delineated themselves as a little bit better, a little bit more right or normal, if you will. And all of it was not because of biology, but because of this social construct we call race. And that led to what we call racism. But I need to make a distinction between racism and prejudice because often those two terms are confused. As the word prejudice suggests, it is a prejudgment about someone who seems to be different than me, but whom I know very little about. It's the personal preference based on various thoughts and feelings and assumptions I have about that other person or the group that that person is a part. I can be prejudiced about race. I can be prejudiced about music. I can be prejudiced about my football team. And we all have prejudice. It's part of human life. Where prejudice becomes destructive is when we have power to inflict our prejudice on another person. So when it comes to race, racism is prejudice plus power. Now, it may be personal power. You know, I may have power over another person. I may be their boss, or I may have, you know, some position that puts me over them. But often the power that most white people have is not in so much a personal power, but it's invested in the educational and economic and political system that give whites access to resources that are not always available to someone else. And it's not because they are unqualified, but it's simply because they are deemed different in some way by society and therefore less valuable than those who have been deemed white. And so racism is this combination of prejudice with power, personal power, but often more power invested in our institutions and in our culture as a whole. Now, when most of us think of racism, we think of someone doing or saying something inherently derogatory or hurtful to a person of another race. We think of the white nationalists who were marching in Charlottesville, or the people who bomb black churches or Jewish synagogues, or are shouting anti-Semitic slogans. We think about people who use derogatory language, use the N-word in reference to people who are black, and other derogatory terms for other racist groups. And that certainly is a form of racism. But racism is far more complex than that. So I want to talk briefly about 4 dimensions of racism. There's the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, the institutional, and the systemic. The intrapersonal are the thoughts and feelings and assumptions we have that we may never share with someone, but even though they're not spoken, we are there. We often think that as long as we don't say these things that are going on in our mind, we're not racist. But interpersonal racism is all that stuff that's going on inside of us. So when an issue of racism comes up, maybe in the news or maybe in a community, how do we think of Black people or Hispanic people or Native Americans? Do they stir up anger in us? Do they stir up fear? Does it stir up anxiety? Do we have stereotypes that we carry around in our heads? What are the messages about people of other races that we have absorbed from our families, from the media, from the wider culture? And a lot of this stuff really is kind of subconscious. It's not that we always go around with these thoughts in our mind, but when something happens, a lot of times they get kicked up. When I was growing up, my father used to tell, we lived outside of New York City when I was very young. And my father would tell this story about my mother driving through Harlem and what a crazy woman she was for driving through Harlem with her blonde, blue-eyed little boy in the car. I absorbed that story and I came to think, wow, if you go in a place where a lot of Black people live, that must be really dangerous. And it was not like anyone ever said that to me, but I absorbed that message and other messages like that said, stay away from certain people in certain places. Just because we don't say things that are racist doesn't mean we aren't participating in racism, because those negative thoughts, those stereotypes impact the way we react and respond to other people. And the thing is, we all have these kind of thoughts. They may be unconscious until they're sort of brought up, like I said, but what do we think? What do we feel? What do we sense in ourselves when a Black man walks toward us, or when we see a Mexican man standing on the corner, or when a Native American issue like the Standing Rock protests of a couple of years ago are going on? What ideas, what feelings, what attitudes get stirred up in us? These are what make up what we call intrapersonal racism. Now, the kind of racism that most of us think about when we hear that word is what I'm calling interpersonal racism. It's interactions between people where things are said and things are done that are very overt and very destructive. And that overt kind of racism is probably the best known and most recognizable kind of interpersonal racism that we participate in. But interpersonal racism can express itself and show itself in other ways. Some scholars have talked about what they refer to as backstage racism. We may be cordial and kind to people of color when we're in their presence, but what happens when we get together with all our white friends? Do we start hearing certain kinds of jokes and certain kind of stereotypes being expressed about those very people we might have been with just an hour ago? And we're standing there and maybe someone tells a somewhat off-color racist kind of joke. How do we respond? Do we just sit there quietly, or do we speak up? Several years ago, I participated in a men's basketball league that played in a weekday evening. And I remember one of the first times I went play, I got there and everybody was playing. So I was waiting for the next game. And everybody who was playing, they were all white men. And there was one guy there who apparently was relatively new as well, who started making all sorts of comments about, oh, you're playing like, an N-word. You're talking like, you're playing like this. And he was making all this racist kind of talk. And I was sitting there wondering, okay, what's going to happen here? And I got to say, I was very relieved. There was one guy who stopped the game. He said, listen, we don't talk like that here. That's not what we do here. But so often, those kind of comments go unchallenged when we are backstage just with our white friends and coworkers. Then there's what other scholars have called is aversive racism. That's when we just remove ourselves when people of color show up or when the topic of race comes up. We just don't want to talk about it. We just don't want to deal with it. So we move ourselves away. And I have found often in social situations where it's mostly white people, maybe all white people, that if I bring up the topic of race or maybe refer to something that happened in the news that had a racial dimension to it, I am amazed sometimes how quick the topic changes and how people, find other things to do. It's a topic that people are very afraid of, and that is what is called aversive racism. And then there are what are referred to as microaggressions. These are subtle, often unconscious things that we do in relationship to people of color that sort of betray a negative attitude. Oftentimes we don't even know we're conveying that message. It might be the tilt of our eyes. It might be the tone of our voice. It might be a deep sigh, maybe the way we cut someone off in a conversation. It's very subtle to us, but very clear to the target, the people of color who are the target of those things. And it communicates in a very subtle but clear way to them that I, as a white person, don't value them as a person of color. So these are some forms of interpersonal racism. That is more than just the very overt, but other ways that we interact with others in a racist manner. Then there is what is referred to as institutional racism. And institutional racism is when racial discrimination is embedded in the policies and practices of an organization. And often these policies and practices were instituted decades ago, when it was much more acceptable in white society to discriminate on the basis of race. But things have not really changed in the organization over all those years. And they're supported by current leaders. And when you raise the question about why things are done a certain way or why people put up with this, people often say, well, it's just the way we do things around here. It's just our normal. And ask yourself, why are the members of boards of major corporations usually overwhelmingly white males? Why are there not more women? Why are there not more people of color? Why are schools in almost every state in the nation that are predominantly made up of students of color usually the most decrepit buildings and the most underfunded schools? Why can a white man and a black man commit the same crime and get drastically different sentences when they go before the judge? Why can a white woman and a Hispanic woman who have the same credentials apply for a job, and more times than not, the white woman will get the job, even though the Hispanic has the same credentials? Why are certain stores or restaurants, do they treat white customers better than they do their Native American customers? We usually don't notice these things when we're part of an organization because we're kind of caught up in the culture, and that's the way things are done. Where we notice it is when someone tries to make a correction, like a company using affirmative action policies in their hiring. And then white people often feel like they're being discriminated against, that somehow black people are getting, or brown people are getting, an advantage that they don't have, when in fact, those whites have often been benefiting unknowingly from discrimination in that organization that was just built into the institution in the way it was. And then kind of building very similar is what is often referred to as structural or systemic racism. And this is where the interrelationships of various institutions and organizations have incorporated into a racially discriminated policy and practice and even laws that have become the accepted norm in society. Probably about 10 years ago now, Michelle Alexander wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, in which she documented how the combination of the police, the courts, and the probation officers and the jails, and even the social services that serve incarcerated men and women was clearly tilted against people of color, so that people of color were disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system, even though they were not committing proportionally more crimes than white people. Housing segregation. Why is it that so many of our cities are still racially segregated? Well, it goes back to the 1930s when the government, in conjunction with the banks, had a practice called redlining, which basically said banks would give loans to people buying and building houses in certain areas and not in others. And so they literally drew a red line around neighborhoods that were predominantly Black and Hispanic, making it difficult for those people to upgrade their homes and even the value of their homes. Right now, we're seeing in many states efforts at voter suppression, making it difficult for poor people, for senior citizens, and people of color to get to the polls on voting days, and gerrymandering, rigging the voting districts so that it concentrates all the people of color in one district and doesn't represent them across the board. And in 2008, mortgage practices, when so many people lost their homes, disproportionately, families that were Black and brown were given mortgages that there was no way they could ever pay, and were thrown into debt. These are examples of structural or systemic racism that is built into the way things work. And it's not just one institution, but it's the whole interaction and relationship between these various systems. So how does this all work? Well, I want to choose what for many people is a very controversial issue and a very controversial subject, Colin Kaepernick. And many of you may have an opinion about him, but I want us to take a look at what happened to Colin Kaepernick and how all these four dimensions of racism came into play. In the fall of 2016, before actually the regular NFL season started, Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the national anthem. It was an exhibition game. And his reason stated for taking the knee was to protest police brutality and police violence against African Americans in many urban communities. Now, this is a right guaranteed by the First Amendment. Any one of us could do this sort of thing. There's no law against it. But what happened? What were people thinking in the intrapersonal level? Oh, he's entitled. He's ungrateful. He's always been a problem. He's just trying to draw attention to himself. And then it became interpersonal because people started saying these things. And fans and coaches and the media started saying all these negative things about Colin Kaepernick just for taking a knee. His coach benched him. And at the end of the season, he was fired. And players across the NFL had to decide whether they would stand with him or stand against him. But then it became institutional because the owners of these NFL teams started making rules in each of their teams about what players could or could not do during the national anthem. And team owners locked Colin Kaepernick out from playing. They wouldn't even give him a tryout, even though he was far better than many of the quarterbacks who were on NFL teams. And then it became systemic. The president weighed in, and he called Kaepernick unpatriotic, that he was, by taking a knee, he was insulting the military. A man takes a knee for a personal protest, and now he's vilified across the country for taking that stand. And one has to only wonder, if Colin Kaepernick had been white, would all of this happen the way it did? That's the way racism works. And it often, these dimensions interact with one another in very clear and yet tangled ways. So when racism is so pervasive in all levels of society, it impacts the culture of that society. I've already said that race is a social construct. White, Black, Latino, Native American, Asian are all given different values based on their perceived racial group. But related to the social construct of race is the social construct of whiteness or white supremacy. It's a social contract that determines the norms and values of a culture. What is the right way to talk? What is the right way to dress? What is the right way to dance? What is American food? Is it the hot dog or the hamburger? Is it the burrito? Is it soul food? What should our relationship be to the police, to the school system, to the political leaders? These may seem personal and maybe even trivial, but when the whiteness of our culture gets involved, it privileges those who get ahead and those who are held back. Who is given better opportunities and who is not given opportunity? Whose opinion matters and whose opinion doesn't matter? I mean, why is it when a white person speaks up, he or she is asserting her rights, but when a Black person or a Latino person speaks up, they're being disruptive or unrespectful or unpatriotic? The values, these values are built into our culture, and that's what we mean by whiteness, or sometimes a lot of people now refer to it as white supremacy. And when that culture is so strong as it is, it leads to what is referred to as white privilege. And that is that whites are not, they're just given a freer ride, given better access to resources, have a better opportunity. Things that are considered white are generally more highly valued. And that's what we call privilege, the advantages and access given by the culture of whiteness. So we come to this dilemma. We know lots of kind and caring white people. And we would like to think that we are kind and caring and open-minded white people. So how can I say that such people are racist? Well, remember at the beginning, I said that racism is not an accusation. It's a description of our condition as white people in this country. All of us, white, Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, we all swim in this sea of whiteness. It's so embedded in our culture that we can't escape it. It's like the air we breathe. We're born into it. We're socialized by it. We're educated in it. We're rewarded and punished by it. And whiteness and white supremacy has shaped us. We can be nice, caring people and racist. It's part of our condition as white people in this country. And the problem is most of us aren't aware of it or willing to admit it if we are aware. And that's where the problem begins. That's what Richard Wright was talking about, that the problem is not the Negro problem, but it's a white person's problem. So what's the result of this whole process? Well, this is a diagram that's actually was developed by 3 Mennonites who wrote a book called Set Free. It's a book that I've used in my classes, and it's also been used in Damascus Road anti-racism training that was, for a long time, was sponsored by the Mennonite Central Committee, and now it's rolled out on its own. It's now off these same anti-racism trainings are offered by a group called Roots of Justice. and still very much Mennonite involved. And this is a picture of an iceberg. And they use the iceberg to explain the impact that racism has on individuals and our society as a whole. As you see, above the water level is what is called overt oppression or overt racism. This is what we usually think about when we think about what is racist. But below the sea level is so much more that goes on. Below that level of consciousness are the institutional and systemic expressions of racism that order and structure our society and our lives, that give whites advantage and privilege. And for many people of color at this level, they despair. It's a sense of fatalism that the system is what it is, and it's rigged against them, and there's nothing they can do it, and it won't change. But even more deeply, if we go to the bottom level, it looks at how racism shapes our identities, how we think about ourselves and how we think about other people, how we think about other white people, how we think about people of color. And many white people, kind of sometimes at a conscious level, sometimes at a less than fully conscious level, develop a sense of what these authors call internalized superiority. And many people of color develop what is often referred to as internalized inferiority or internalized racism, where they turn the attitudes and stereotypes and values that have been put on them by others, and they turn them on themselves so they see themselves as of less value and less worth. And you see, so racism is not just a bad thing that happens to people, it distorts how we see ourselves and how we see other people and how we interact. And it's at the root of why it's so hard sometimes for white folks and people of color to actually interact at a truly authentic level. So the challenge and the calling is, how do we face racism? Racism is not just a bad thing that happens between people. It's something that has shaped who we are as individuals, shaped us as communities, shaped us as churches, shaped us as a society. It's shaped how we are socialized to think and act. It shapes our institutions. It is embedded in the systems in our society. It pervades our culture as a nation. And it shapes our identity such that we cannot understand or relate meaningfully with people whose race is different than our own. And that's the challenge, to become aware of the racism within us and the impact and the influence that has had on us, and to undo and unlearn and then relearn the best we can. And that's where I'm going to pick it up next week when we talk about white fragility. What does it look like inside of us? What are the kinds of reactions we have that sometimes make the problem worse, even though we're trying to protect ourselves? But at this point, I'm done with my thoughts, so I want to open up to others. And I see there's at least one question that someone posted, so I'll start with that. So the question is there racism against another but not whites, like Asians against blacks? Yes. It's not as pronounced in our society, but certainly there are, well, for starters, no question there are prejudices that exist between people of different races. And sometimes those prejudices turn into coercion and forces of power against people. For instance, I know in my neighborhood in West Philadelphia, predominantly Black neighborhood, there are a number of stores that are owned by Chinese store owners. And they're usually like little corner stores where you can get food and maybe some medicine and that sort of thing. And sometimes there's been some animosity between those two groups in some of those communities. And so that's an example where there can be racism against other groups. between other groups. Any questions or comments?
I think it's been said that churches are one of the most segregated parts of our whole country. Do you agree with that? And is that good, bad, indifferent? Should we be rebelling against that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a complicated question. Let me start with churches that are predominantly of a racial or ethnic group other than white. For many racial and ethnic minorities, the church has been the one place where, in the midst of the worst of racism in this country, going back into the previous centuries, the church was often the one place that they could go where they felt like they were fully respected and had a sense of dignity. And so, and I know I was part of a church several years ago where there was a Korean congregation that used the building as well. And for the Koreans, it was also a place where they could transmit their culture to younger people. So there have been some really valuable reasons why certain racial groups have segregated themselves, if you will, for the purposes of transmitting culture or just surviving in a racist culture. On the other hand, there's been a lot of destructive things done in the name of the church throughout the centuries, and such that slavery was justified, violence against people of color was justified. I think one of the most chilling pictures I've ever seen is a picture of a lynching that occurred somewhere in the South in the 1800s, or in the early 1900s. And there's a little girl looking up at this body hanging in the tree with her Sunday school best on. And it was like she had gone to church and then they went to the lynching. So the church the white church in particular, has been very, has a bad history in that. So I think there is definitely a place for multicultural, multiracial churches. And in fact, I was part of a couple of multiracial churches, one in Boston, another in Jersey City. And the challenge in a multiracial church is creating space where everyone feels accepted, but also is willing to kind of flex with other people. Because in fact, the church in Jersey City, there was like 14 different language groups, or 14 different racial groups and 7 different language groups. And I used to tell people, you really got to want to be here because it's a lot of work. And I think, we think, well, if we just kind of all come together and praise God and it'll all work out. But I think there's something, I think as we move forward, you'll see more churches really taking seriously their desire to be a mixed race church. Some of it depends on the community they draw from. I mean, part of the problem with a lot of churches is they're in white churches, they're in predominantly white communities. So it's going to be hard to attract people. So you need to kind of go where people are if you want to have that kind of church. But it's, having been a part of a couple of churches like that, I can tell you it's really wonderful, and it's really a lot of hard work. Any other questions or comments?
Looks like we have a chat question.
Oh, okay. How is inherited skin color not biology? Good question. It's not that biology doesn't make any difference, but they've done studies with people of different races and really looked at the DNA and found that people have more diversity within racial groups than between racial groups. That's one thing. The other thing is skin color is really a tricky thing. Now, if someone is really pasty white or really dark black, then there's no question. But it's kind of in the middle. When you're in the middle, you begin to realize, how do people identify themselves and how they identify others? So, if you have a light-skinned black person, they may be the same skin color as a person who loves to get a nice tan in the summer. And how would it come one is called white and one is called black? I once had a class that was predominantly made up of African Americans of a whole range of colors, from the very darkest to very, very light. And all of them identified as African American, and yet I noted to them that it's really not about skin color. It's about some of these other things. It's about their ancestry. It's about how they were categorized in school and other places. So it's not that it's not about biology, but biology is not the sole determining factor. And in the history of racism in the country, there were some African Americans who were so light-skinned that they, quote, passed. And it was only when they were discovered actually to be African American became a problem. I think of the case of, you may remember a few years ago, of a woman named Rachel Dolezal, who worked for the NAACP. She was the chapter president of the NAACP in Spokane, Washington. And she presented herself and carried herself as if she was African American. And then she was outed by her family and said, no, she's not African American, she's white. And created quite a controversy. Well, that had more to do than just skin color. It had to do with these other things that make up the social construct. So that's what I mean. Is it possible for racism to exist without the element of power? Can someone explain the question? I'm not sure what's behind the question. I mean, is it possible to elaborate on that question just a bit?
I think the question was that as you have sort of defined racism in your presentation, prejudice and power, is racism primarily linked to the element of power, or is,
Yeah, no, I think that as I tried to say in that slide, the distinction between prejudice and racism is the element of power, is the ability to enforce my views on someone else and place higher value on it. So, we may have prejudices about people for whatever reason. We can have all sorts of prejudice. It have nothing to do with race. But it's when we are able to, in a sense, get our way and impress our way to become the way, that's when it becomes racism. And this would also apply to, like, sexism. Men and women are different, yes. And women like certain things, maybe men like some. But when someone says, this is the way it's going to be, and women, you have to be over here, and men, you are over here, and men, you get power, and women, you have less power, then that becomes sexism. And we may see it on an interpersonal level, but we see it on an institutional level. When we look at how women and men are paid for the same job, for instance. Who gets promotions, who gets to be on the board. There's something going on there that has to do with who has access to power and decision-making and others don't.
You
other
mentioned that when that writer went to France, he felt racism was not nearly as oppressive. Is there a fundamental difference, like say in Europe, how prevalent racism is or how it manifests itself compared to America?
Well, it manifests itself in different ways because there are different there's a different racial makeup in certain countries. You know, for instance, in Europe, a lot of the people of color who come to England or France or Germany, there's a colonial history there that, you know, they once were ruled by those European countries, and so they tend to go there. So there, in some ways, there's difference that way, and it's not saying when Richard Wright was in France that there was no racism in France, but you know, sometimes I don't know the whole thing going on. I just know that there were a lot of artists and poets who really made their name in Europe before they came back. You know, people like Langston Hughes and Richard Wright and Marian Anderson. They spent a lot of time in Europe because they were more accepted there. But I think racism in various forms exists in a lot of countries. And to the earlier question, you know, of racism of one racial group against another, we see that going on in Africa and places in Asia too. So, you know, it's not just a white-black thing or a white, you know, another group thing. There are all kinds of racism going on. I mean, you know, some people think, for instance, that the treatment of Israelis against the Palestinian people is a form of racism. You know, I'm not going to comment on that, but that's another example of where that language is used with totally different groups. Okay, the comment was made. You gave the example of systemic racism offering loans to people who couldn't pay them. The argument we hear sometimes is the racist to deny loans to people of color. And yeah, both are right. I mean, when I was talking earlier about redlining, essentially that's what happened in the era of redlining, where an African-American person would go to a bank because they want to, you know, fix up their house, or they want to purchase a house. And it was just much harder for them to get a loan, or the loan was at a higher rate. So that's certainly the case. But in the 2008, there was all sorts of crazy stuff, illegal stuff going on with banks, and they were preying on very vulnerable people, and Black and brown people were very vulnerable who went. And so that's both are true.
Is there hope? It all seems kind of really hard to see an escape from this somehow. In the last few years with the Me Too movement, there seem to be some fundamental shifts in the way we think about inequality in different areas. Does that translate to racism as well in any way?
Well, first of all, I think most people who look at this issue would agree that regardless of how much we struggle today, in many ways we're in a better place than we were in the 1950s and 1960s. You know, in the 1950s and 1960s, overt racism was perfectly acceptable. That's not acceptable anymore. And while the gains of people of color in terms of jobs and wealth and all those things has not caught up to white folks. It's better than it was in the 50s and 60s in some way. What is disconcerting to me is with the election of Barack Obama and then continuing with the election of Donald Trump, it just seems like the vitriol and the polarization between people around issues of race has just intensified. And the, people of color are feeling a kind of pressure and a kind of stress that they have not felt for decades in these last few years. And, when Barack Obama got elected, everybody said, oh, we elected a black president. Maybe we've gotten past racism. And what we did instead was we revealed it, because people started, questioning his birth, questioning his religion, and all sorts of things that had never happened to a president. And then with the election of Donald Trump, the extreme racist groups, the white nationalist groups, have seemed to gain a greater boldness. And I was reading a document from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is an organization that tracks racial hate groups, and not just white nationalists. I mean, they track all sorts of groups. And they've said that the number of groups that exist because of the internet and because of the polarization has increased in the last few years. So we're in this really difficult time. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we're talking about it. And we're more and more people, white and people of color, are saying this can't continue. And it really can't. I mean, just from a really practical standpoint, depending on who you talk to, somewhere in the 2040s, the percentage of whites who make up the American population will be less than 50%. The number of people who identify as Latino or Hispanic will be about 30%. Asians will probably double from their current 6% to about 12%. African Americans will still be where they are today, which is somewhere around 12 to 14%. But the demographics of the country are changing. And so if only for that reason, we who are white need to realize, okay, this is not the 1950s. This is, by 2050, we will be demographically a very different country. And I know that's very frightening for people, but it creates also this great opportunity to try and figure out how to work this out. And so, and I think the church has a valuable role to play in this. The church is the one place where we say, no, there are certain things that are right and wrong because our God says it. And so I think, there could be some great things that come from that. I mean, the fact that the Mennonite Conference selected an African American to be their executive director, was a positive sign. So I think there's hope, but it's not going to be an easy ride. I often tell people, when I was in my 20s, I was working in Boston as a youth worker with Puerto Rican, African American, and Irish Catholic white kids. And I figured, by the time I'm 40, we'll have this race thing figured out. I'm 66, and I don't think I'm going to live to see it all worked out. But I've committed myself to doing what I can and talking about it. So I have hope, because the other option is not acceptable. So I guess that's my answer to your question. Any other comments or questions?
I got a question for you about this, how we define racism and power. thought about and heard about and talked about racism for 50, 60 years, but it wasn't until in the last year I came across this idea that it's only those who are in power that are defined as racist. Is this something that's newly defined, or has this been a definition that's been around for years and years?
The prejudice plus power, I heard, probably 30 years ago. So that's not new. I think what's new is an emphasis on the fact that what we call racism is in these broader dimensions that I've talked about, and that you don't, just like I described when I was growing up, it wasn't like I was consciously doing things to put other people down, but the way my life was structured through the institutions that I was a part of, the neighborhoods I went to, the colleges I attended, I was just getting all sorts of doors open to me that weren't open to others. I went to Duke University in 1971, and it wasn't until about 10 years ago when I went to a reunion that I learned that the Black students who were in my class were only the 6th class that admitted Black undergraduates into this university. Well, Duke was 100 and some years old at that point. So that's 100 years where Blacks did not get opportunities, an educational opportunity, though they were qualified. And so I think it's just in recent years, I think we're taking a look at the institutions, we're taking a look at the systems and saying, okay, how are they impacting our life together as a society? I mean, when Michelle Alexander wrote her book, The New Jim Crow, it wasn't like she was the only person saying it, but it was finally there was a hearing for it, and people said, wow, yes, there's something wrong with our criminal justice system that it treats people so unfairly. And I think, I've been involved in trying to get funding for public education in our public schools in Pennsylvania, and there's a clear racial bias in terms of how the money is distributed. I mean, we can document it from district to district. So we're just starting to take a look at how this is operating in a way that many people had just not thought about and challenged. I mean, even Martin Luther King, only near the end of his life did he start raising some questions about government and about other institutions. I don't think it's a new idea, but it's been a developing idea.
Let's see if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. You started it with being a racist is not an accusation, but a description.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was really apt to help us start a conversation with people, because I think we get so defensive and we often use racist as, I've used it before to describe somebody as an accusation. And so can you just comment some more on how to help us be less defensive and be able to introduce this concept more in our conversations with each other?
Well, yeah, I'm actually going to talk a lot about that in the third session, but I think, it's a hard thing for people to hear, because we've been socialized to thinking that racism is an accusation. And legitimately, people will say, well, I didn't get any breaks in life. I've had to work hard. I've been discriminated against, and they probably have. So I would say when that sort of stuff comes up, I don't try to deny it or dismiss it. I usually start by saying, tell me more. Tell me how you came to feel the way you did or see things the way you did. And try to get people to start talking about their story. And then I I use that as an opportunity then to ask questions, to get clarification, and then at some point to introduce maybe a new way of thinking about it. And I mean, I don't think there is a easy way to talk with some folks about race issues. It's just such a, in my experience, such a volatile subject. But I think instead of getting defensive, I try to be open and say, let's talk about it. And then, you know, hopefully as the conversation unfolds, I can begin to share ways I think about it. And the other thing is, you know, it's never solved in one conversation. To me, it's an ongoing conversation. And, you know, I have a friend who sees things very differently than me, not just on race, but a whole host of things. And we often reach a point where it's like, okay, that's all we can deal with right now. But we keep coming back. So I think the other thing is that in talking with folks, you know, it's just a matter of kind of being quietly and gently persistent, but also realizing it often takes more than one conversation. And I think the way we're going to change is these kind of one-to-one conversations and one-to-one interactions. But I'll get into that in a lot more detail on the third night. That's what I really want to talk about the third night. Any other comments or questions? So Chris, are we done for tonight?
Well, we've spent an hour and 15, and we've covered a lot of interesting topics. And I think probably we should wrap it up for tonight. Appreciate what we've covered so far, and just for everybody's information, this has been recorded and it will be posted on the conference website probably by Thursday. That's Amanda's target, to get them posted relatively soon. So we would like to have everyone come back in a week, same time, same place, and we'll go to session 2. And so I think we will wrap it up for tonight and say thank you, and God bless, and good evening.
Yeah, and thank you all for your questions and comments. They're very good questions, and I hope I addressed them in the same way, appropriately. So thank you all, and we'll hopefully see you next week.
All right, we will close our meeting.